Today on Stronger Than Reason, we hit a big wall of noise with the early EPs by Curve. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. Today we're going way back to the fall of 1991. Such a pleasant year, relatively speaking. And much like Jules Winnfield, I was going through a transitional time. I was going to college, but was still living at home. Most of my close friends had gone away to schools elsewhere, as they do. We all scattered. But we had this newfangled thing called email that still connected us. And I distinctly remember my first tentative steps into the world of the internet and email. It was in my freshman programming class, which taught me Fortran 77, believe it or not. Yeah, that's how old I am, folks. But yeah, I remember sitting at my desk in the back of the class, naturally, and seeing the professor write internet on the old chalkboard. And yes, of course, it was a chalkboard. It wasn't a whiteboard. He went on to describe this internet thing, which, as far as I could tell, was some military communication system that anyone with any sense wouldn't give a bunch of freshmen access to. But access we got, and I'm pretty sure he issued little bits of paper with our login credentials and told us where the one computer lab was all the way across campus in the engineering building. And there I was 2 days into my college career, and I was sitting there thinking to myself, why do a bunch of people who drive trains get their own building? Thank goodness I kept my thoughts to myself. But anyway, as if to sell this idea to us, he wrote the words electronic mail on the board below internet and went on to explain the concept of electronic mail, or as he called it, email, a term that made more than a few of us laugh. Why? Because it sounded unnatural and forced, like something Larry in marketing might have come up with. It sounded dumb in exactly the same way that we all thought the term vaping sounded dumb in 2013. But of course, now we're all used to people reading email while vaping. Anyway, a light bulb finally went off in my head, and I thought, maybe I could use this so-called email to exchange witty messages with my faraway friends. I mean, I was already writing them letters, and do you remember writing letters? Yeah, I sent them out through what my professor derisively called snail mail, but I liked letters because you could do fun things with them. You could fill them full of dirt or salt or cake mix, or you could drip red food coloring all over the envelope so it looked like it came from a murder scene, and my mom had fun explaining that one at the post office. Or you could cover the envelope with stickers or funny comic strips or do a watercolor on it and all kinds of stuff. And I kind of miss those days. But then again, I don't, because every year, even now, I do send about a half dozen or so cards to people I'm close to because, frankly, I hate buying Hallmark cards. I like to think that I still have enough artistic skill and creativity to not give the stupid Hallmark company 50 of my dollars every year. So yeah, I do make my own cards to send. They're a bit more restrained these days, but not much. Every year has a theme, and last year, for no reason, I decided to draw everyone's favorite candy bar. And needless to say, everyone was confused. No one understood what Snickers bars or M&Ms had to do with their birthday. And the previous year, I thought it would be great to draw famous memes, and needless to say, everyone was confused. Turns out my close family doesn't recognize Doge or the Success Kid or Business Cat. I mean, what are they doing? Living in a hole? Anyway, my point is that you can have a bit more hijinks with actual mail than you can with email. But regardless, in 1991, I considered myself nothing if not a modern man, so I was determined to master this internet thing and email in particular. So one day I ventured forth to the engineering building and found it inhabited largely by dudes, all of whom had questionable hygiene. Alas, I'd become all too familiar with them in coming years, and sure enough, I found the computer lab right where it was supposed to be. But I thought, where were all the computers? All I saw were these amber screen monitors scattered around a bunch of lunch tables. And I probably asked this question to whoever was in charge, and they might have rolled their eyes in a long-suffering way and explained that all of these terminals were connected to a mainframe computer that was kept well away from the likes of me somewhere in a temperature-controlled room and fed grapes by scantily clad minions waving palm fronds or something like that. I don't know, I wasn't really paying attention, and he said all this was possible due to something he called time-sharing that involved me buying beachside rental property from him for some low price, but only for 2 weeks of the year. All of this was terribly confusing. Fortunately, a classmate rescued me, sat me down at a terminal, and showed me how to log in, as he put it, and bang, I was a netizen at last. So keep in mind, kids, that this was still early days. It was a few years before the web became a thing. This was back when surfing the net still meant command line prompts, Telnet, Gopher, and FTP. And if you were really lucky, you could score an account on a bulletin board and live chat with real people. But for me, that would still take some time. For now, I found the email program and tentatively tried to write a message to my good friend EF1J over at his school. And I don't know exactly what I wrote. Probably something like, "Hey, dingus, are you reading this on the information superhighway?" But it turns out I accidentally sent it to someone else with the initials EF at his school, who fortunately was very understanding and helpfully pointed out my mistake. So soon enough, EF1J and I were emailing away. Interestingly, we continued to send messages that whole year and inadvertently documented all of our goings-on. And we actually kept all of those old emails, so now we have a pretty thorough documentation of our freshman college experiences, which we like to refer back to often. It's pretty cool. Now, one of the things that we regularly touched base on was this show on MTV called 120 Minutes. If you're not aware, it was the so-called alternative show. It was on late on Saturday night when the respectable people had all gone to bed. And the idea was that the very English host, Dave Kendall, would walk us through 20 or so lesser-known or cult bands who were signed to independent labels. And that was really the definition of alternative in 1992, not signing to a major. Naturally, I recorded the whole thing on my video cassette recorder, or VCR. That way I could get a good night's sleep, go to class the next day, come home, and fast forward through all the boring Danielle Dax, Smashing Pumpkins, and Buffalo Tom crap to get to what I considered the good stuff. Front 242, Ministry, Nine Inch Nails, New Order, Joy Division, The Sisters of Mercy, KMFDM, and basically any of the bands I've ever talked about on this show. So EF1J and I would enthusiastically discuss the previous week's good videos, but there weren't often many surprises. For a while, I just tended to see bands that I had heard of, and I wasn't really wowed by anything completely new. And all of that changed in October when Dave Kendall introduced a song called Coast is Clear by a band I had never heard of called Curve. And at that moment, they were everything I ever wanted to see in a band. There was thick, fat bass, hard-hitting beats, wall of noise guitars, and just to quote Motorhead, everything louder than everything else. And on top of it all, the cherry on the sundae, the butter pat on top of the pancakes, these amazing ethereal vocals. And the video, it just stopped me in my tracks. I can only describe the singer as a goth chick, dark hair cut in a bob, like she walked straight out of a Philip K. Dick novel. She's the kind of girl Winona Ryder would play in A Scanner Darkly, and she was wearing this Ramones shirt and just breathing these vocals all over this gritty blast of white noise and drum fury. And watching the video, it did seem like they were a full band with drums, guitar, the whole thing. The video had all this cool lo-fi black and white cuts of the band, close-ups of this singer talking over this guy's shoulder, and the sound, I gotta say, it sounded absolutely amazing. It was a completely different thing from anything else, yet familiar, a new blend of the familiar maybe, like you threw a bunch of desserts into a blender and whipped them into some kind of new smoothie. So you had dance elements, rock elements, but it didn't sound like industrial really, it didn't sound like straight rock, it didn't sound like straight dance. In that moment, it sounded to me like evolution. Like this was clearly going to be the next thing. And this song, Coast is Clear, it had this repeating riff that to me sounded like an air raid siren. You know, you hear a sound like that, kids, and it's time to duck and cover. It's that thing you hear when it's time to put your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye. It was powerful, and I tell you what, I started talking up this song to all my friends. Like, you have to hear this new band, Curve. And they wanted to know about them. Where were they from? Did they have an album? Who was in the band? What other songs did they have? And I had zero answers. Nothing. This band was a complete enigma to me. All I had was this one song. But remember, MTV, how they used to put the band name, the song name, and the album name in the corner there at the beginning and at the end of the video. I think they threw the label name in as well. And years later, they would add the director's name. Anyway, in my 200th viewing of this video, it occurred to me to check the name of the album. And there it was, Frozen. Needless to say, I flew up to the local National Record Mart. I scrutinized the cassettes for this debut release by Curve, and I was disappointed. There were no cassettes to be had. But back then I had something that I no longer have today. Endless time and patience. I literally searched the entire store for anything at all by Curve, and lo, 30 minutes later I found something. It was in the CD singles section of all places, but there it was, a CD by Curve called Frozen. But why wasn't it in with the albums? Some quick analysis revealed that it wasn't an album at all, but a 4-track EP. Unfortunately, at the time, I not only didn't have a CD player on which I could enjoy this thing, but I was also pretty much broke. So I didn't buy it. In coming years, I would fix my cash flow problem and would buy the fixed CD by 9 Inch Nails before I owned a CD player. But for now, I was out of luck, Chuck. At least I could confirm that this release wasn't a figment of my imagination. I saw that Coast is Clear was the lead-off track, followed by 3 more songs, The Color Hurts, Frozen, and Zoo. And the fact that they used Commonwealth spelling suggested this band was from England, not the States. And that was it, my friends. For months, that's all I had to go on. One video and one CD single that I couldn't play, so didn't buy, but I still loved this band. Fortunately, my patience would be rewarded because they'd soon make a second video. One night I captured it on my VCR, and it was a song called Fait Accompli. And if it were possible, I loved it even more than Coast is Clear. Again, they just raised the bar. Still, no album. They issued it as a single in England, but I never saw a copy in a retail store in the US. So I did have another video to go on, but I still didn't know anything about this band. And you know what? That was okay. That was great, in fact. There's something to be said for the days when you couldn't just jump on Wikipedia to find out an artist's complete backstory, blood type, and credit card number. I think it was more intriguing, and I kind of miss that sense of mystery that you used to have about a band. Like, even if a band these days tries to cultivate some sort of mystery, it's not long before someone takes a photo of them out walking the dog or something. So it's just very, very hard to do that in this age where everyone has a high-powered camera and instant access to global communication. But luckily, I got another tidbit in March of '92 when Curve's lead singer, who I learned was Tony Halliday, gave an interview on 120 Minutes. So yeah, Dave Kendall sat her down in the studio and grilled her about Curve. And my memory of that interview is a little funny because I remember Dave flirting with her pretty hardcore. I mean, you know, you can't blame the guy for trying, but she did give him a lot more insight into the band. She said that the nucleus was her and Dean Garcia, the bassist, and that they had 3 other folks in the band, Debbie and Alex on guitar and Monty on the drums. And that's very democratic of her, but in fact, Curve proper was always just Tony and Dean. Everyone else was just a session or live musician, and Tony and Dean wrote all the music. So she also used the term shoegaze to describe Curve's music. Not that Curve was shoegaze, but she said they held some of the same attitudes as those bands. And this might have been the first time that I had ever heard that term, not being an inveterate shoegaze lover, and I wasn't quite sure what she was talking about. And, you know, to this day, I'm not really into it so much, although I have seen School of Seven Bells live several times, as well as Slow Dive, and I enjoyed those shows a lot. But what can I say? Back in the day, shoegaze just never really rang my bell. You know, to each their own. In retrospect, it seems to me that Curve built a new sound by bolting the wall of noise guitar from shoegaze onto the electric house beats of industrial and throwing some deep-ass bass over the whole thing. And I think the key to their success was in the engineering and mixing so that all this junk that was in there just didn't wind up in a big sonic mud bath. And one big component of their success was engineer Alan Moulder, who I just mentioned in the last episode because he got tapped for the Downward Spiral just a few years later. And from there, he mixed for a veritable who's who of popular forward-thinking bands. And of course, he would continue to work with Curve throughout the rest of their career. It was surely not because Tony Halliday was married to him. I'm sure that was just a coincidence. So I was soon able to use the internet to dig around and find out about Tony and Dean's previous bands, and the fact that Dean did a bunch of session work for various rock musicians. Interestingly, he had played bass for the Eurythmics for a bunch of years, and he's credited for playing the intro bass guitar on the classic Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers track, Don't Come Around Here No More, which was co-written by David A. Stewart. So I'm sure David brought Dean into the project, knowing Dean from the Eurythmics. I just think that's great that Dean played on some classic Tom Petty tracks. It's just completely unexpected. I do love me some Tom Petty music. I think he might also be in that very small club of artists that everyone loves, along with Weird Al and ZZ Top. Anyway, it turns out Fait Accompli was a lead-off single because it soon appeared on their debut album, Doppelganger. And strangely, I didn't buy that album at the time. It probably had something to do with having limited funds and the fact that some of my friends bought it. But I do remember us blasting that album out of cars that summer. And what a summer it was, summer of 92. It was the one where I got fired as a busboy from my hometown's only fancy restaurant. And I got a job helping my friend Salty remodel a house. So at this point, I could go into a lot of stories about that job. That could probably be a whole separate podcast. But let's just say it was hilarious from day to day and is probably, looking back on it, one of the jobs I enjoyed most so far. Some highlights in no particular order. Sanding a ceiling and getting drywall compound in my hair, which resulted in really cool dreadlocks. And we briefly considered selling drywall powder as a hair care product. We were throwing an old mattress out of a third-story window and watching it bounce into the street, pouring excess drywall compound out the window and accidentally getting it all down the side of the house. Oops! Painting the front porch only to have the neighbor's cat run across the wet paint, jump up on the railing, and leap down the house, leaving cat prints all the way down to the sidewalk. Getting there at 8 a.m., promptly blasting music out the windows with my trusty Toshiba boombox. Painting the ceiling without adequately covering the hardwood floors, then having to scrape the paint off the floors and refinish them. Using ultra-gloss polyurethane to finish the floors. Because, you know, if a little gloss is good, then obviously more gloss is better. And then nearly going blind when the sun hit it, and deciding it was a good idea to only eat giant pixie sticks for lunch. So yeah, I could go on and on. Every day was just a ludicrous adventure, but after all the messing around, at the end of the day, the place really did look great, I have to say. And it taught me that that sort of work can be super fulfilling, which is good for when I eventually bought a house of my own, and still dealing with that nonsense today. Anyway, we were all listening to Doppelganger that summer. I particularly remember one of my friends blasting it out of his Volkswagen convertible, but I'm not going to dig into Doppelganger here. Instead, I want to focus on those earlier songs on the EPs, songs like Coast is Clear. So you have to imagine my surprise when I discovered that Frozen was the second of 3 introductory EPs, the first being Blindfold and the third being Cherry. All 3 were released within months of each other. Now, I had never seen Blindfold or Cherry, so this came as something of a shock, but I love the idea, and I still love the idea, of a band introducing itself to the world through a trilogy of EPs. That's exactly what the Beta Band would do a few years later, as I described way back in episode 9. I just think that approach makes a lot of sense, because a prospective fan might balk at shelling out $20 for an album they might not like. But, $7 for an EP, sure, why not? And it's even cooler to have 3 of them, again, separate yet related. Plus, then you have an obvious next move. You collect them all onto a single disc like the Beta Band did with the 3 EPs. 4 songs per EP collected, that's a 12-song album. Boom. So before your debut studio album, you have 4 releases to sell, which is a good deal. And that's exactly what Curve did too. I just didn't know about it because they only did a video for Coast is Clear, and MTV was how I was getting information about them. So yes, now they had Doppelganger out, but I still wanted all those early EPs. But how could I get them? Because Frozen and all the others were already gone from National Record Mart, and as far as I was concerned, in my neck of the woods, they were now unobtainium, at least until they showed up in used CD bins, but, I wanted them right now. Anyway, so let's continue with the story. Spring gave summer a mist and passed straight away into fall, whereupon I moved to the big city to continue my education, in engineering no less. See, someone had taken me aside and explained that it was more than just driving trains, but as an ironic twist, I myself became one of those nerds in the engineering building. I bet you never saw that coming, although I like to think my hygiene was always on point. Nevertheless, I still like Curve. I just had little to show for it. I was always on the fence about getting Doppelganger, but as it turned out, it would be a few more years until I would. But in the meantime, I still wanted my copy of Coast is Clear. So fortunately, my patience was rewarded because they collected the first 3 EPs into a full-length compilation album just for the North American market, which they charmingly titled Pubic Fruit. And here it is. Not only that, but they threw in an extended mix of fait accompli. Unfortunately, they couldn't fit the 2 B-sides from the fait accompli single, which were called Arms Out and Sigh, but that would probably have pushed this CD into its space limits, especially in 1992. But I thought it was great that this CD now existed and I could buy it. But what was really interesting in retrospect was how I bought it, because for the first time in my life, I did it without walking into a record store at all. See, again, I was getting more and more into this crazy thing called the internet, which still didn't have much to do with the World Wide Web. Sure, I was web curious, and I may have experimented with NCSA Mosaic on the X-Window stations, as college kids will do. I might have even whipped up my own homepage on the school network with some very basic HTML. But, the web, honestly, was still very much in its infancy. And the watchword for the time was e-commerce, because someone had figured out how to accept credit card payments over the internet. And CD Now was one company that was doing this at the time, but they didn't have a web interface, they had a telnet interface. That meant I had to use a command line to log into a remote CD Now server, and then use more commands to browse their inventory, make my selection, and provide all of my payment and shipping details, which sounds nuts today, because naturally you couldn't even see the damn CD to know exactly what it was you were buying. It was just a text interface, but I didn't care. I happened to have a nice shiny new credit card and was itching to try it out, and no parents around to tell me not to. Again, I was nothing, if not a modern man. So I gave CD Now my credit card number and blood type, and the first CD I ever ordered over the internet was Pubic Fruit by Curve. Imagine my delight when it showed up at my dorm a week or so later in a nifty little cardboard box. And then the floodgates were open, and I haven't looked back since, way too many CDs later. But it's funny in a way that it all started with this CD, this exact one. But that begs the question, what was the first music I bought digitally? And that must have happened when I got my first iPod in 2001 or so, if I recall. I'm pretty sure I had some iTunes store credits, and I used them maybe to get Skinny Puppy's Bites album, which also kind of felt like I was getting away with something, except I didn't even have a damn disc to hold after Steve Jobs took my cash. And, these days I think I end up buying most music digitally just because it's a pain in the ass to rip it from CD. I do have a little USB CD-ROM drive, and it's just kind of a piece of junk, and it takes like a half an hour to rip an album, so I can't really be fussed with it anymore. So yeah, I kind of go digital. but I still can't bring myself to sign up for streaming. I just think there's something fundamentally wrong with renting music. I got to own it one way or another. So, Spotify can bite me even though I'm using their podcast service. Hi, guys. So, yeah, let's talk about this record already. Pubic Fruit is a catchy name, I suppose. One thing I've always liked about Curve is their packaging. They tend to put an unusual photo on the cover. Here, it's a photo of some rambutans, which are a kind of Vietnamese fruit, which I'm told tastes something like grapes. I've never actually tried one. I've never even seen one in real life. But if I did see one, I'd have to get it just because of this album and try it out. But unfortunately, they decided to bury the cool photo under all of this text, which is kind of a drag. I wish they hadn't done that. But yeah, here are the 3 original EPs, though, in release order. There's 4 tracks each, plus the extended mix of Fait Accompli, which indeed goes on for quite some time. And, the liner notes say that they put it on here because the single was never released in the US, so that was nice of them. But, it's not a remix so much as just a longer version of the album track. So there is a cool booklet in here. Let's pull this out. Oh, look how cool the disc looks. That's great. Here's guitarist Debbie Smith looking really cool. And then we have a list of album information and credits. Then we have the cover of the Blindfold EP with all these chimpanzees. Here's a portrait of Tony Halliday, drummer Steve Monty. This is the cover for Frozen. Then the cover for the Cherry EP and a screenshot of Dean Garcia playing the bass. And finally, the cover of the Fait Accompli single, which is some Romanesco broccoli. And of course, a portrait of guitarist Alex Mitchell. Yeah. So by the way, the credits suggest that the Frozen cover is actually a painting, which is awesome if so, because it looks like someone took a photo zoomed in on an old CRT television screen, which is like an old trick of mine. But I once went to an art show where this painter, Daniel Finch, had painstakingly hand-painted scenes that looked like zoomed-in CRT displays, and I really enjoyed his stuff. To me, it was a fascinating blend of the analog and the digital, kind of, modern pointillism, really. It's just such a cool idea. So maybe that's what we're looking at here with the Frozen cover. Interestingly, it was attributed to someone named J.P. Woombaby, who, when I Googled him, shows up strongly associated with the band spc-eco. That's spc-eco, which is, of course, the band Dean Garcia founded after Curve. So I suspect that J.P. Woombaby is, in fact, an alias, but we may never know. All in all, though, I really like this packaging because it does make me feel like I did buy the original EPs in some way. I like it a lot. And the disc is cool too, obviously. But what about the music? There's definitely a core sound here. The beats on disc are mostly electronic, mostly samples or sequenced. There's a prominent bass line on all these songs. Dean's signature sound is very dubby. It's more of a throb than defined notes. He has a lot of slides and transitions. That's just his sound. It's like a slightly updated take on Jaw Wobble. And that's the rhythm section. And above that, imagine just a huge bed of guitar tracks, all interlocking, interweaving, swirling, diving, rhythm and leads. And above it all, delivering what my bandmate and I always referred to as the creamy goodness, Tony Halliday's awesome vocals. She is the sweetness that makes all of this palatable. The first track on Blindfold, 10 Little Girls, showcases that sound perfectly. I'd argue that Curve carved out such a distinctive sound that their stuff is almost immediately recognizable. Last episode, we talked about 9 Inch Nails and the Downward Spiral, which is really the opposite kind of album, one that has a huge sonic range, covers a lot of territory. Curve is the opposite. They've carved out their niche and they're gleefully living right there. Not unlike KMFDM, say, or even Viagra Boys. Anyway, 10 Little Girls is quite similar to Fait Accompli music-wise. It's practically an early version of it. And sure, it's noisy, but you'll notice that it's pop music. The structure follows all the golden rules. You got your verse, chorus, verse, and so on. Except in this case, instead of a guitar lead, we have a rap breakdown. And the whole thing isn't exactly hummable, but it is absolutely a head nodder. And then we have I Speak Your Every Word, which immediately hits us with some funky wah-wah rhythm guitar. And by the way, these tunes are all very major key for the most part, very powerful, very in your face. The beats are very of the early 90s when we were still feeling the aftershocks of Manchester and the dance music craze. It's a really uplifting vibe. Tony is all through this track nearly every second. If she's not singing, she's vocalizing in some way. There's just layers and layers of her, and she's able to harmonize so well, which gives her vocals this depth and beauty. It's just really amazing, and I really like this song. I like the lead guitar line throughout and the wah guitar. It's all a bit more better defined than the usual guitar wash, and the arrangement is very clean, and at one point all the guitar just drops out, and it's Tony over the rhythm, which makes the song always interesting as you're listening to it. But it's a relatively short song, and it just really abruptly fades out, like one of the fastest fade outs I think I've ever heard. And it goes right into the EP's title track, Blindfold, which right away we notice is more down tempo. But, it still has a prominent breakbeat. It has Dean's signature bass. It's just a bit sparser, a bit more menacing. Honestly, it does remind me of School of Seven Bells, and I mentioned that band and that I'd seen them a few times. Those stories would be worth an episode or two. Imagine Curve with two identical twin lead singers, and you would be pretty close. But yeah, I'll save all those stories for later. But Blindfold, this song is really cool, but honestly, at this point, the record is starting to sound like one long song. A great song, but it sounds all of a piece. And then we round out the first EP with No Escape from Heaven, which, by the way, according to Tony, in an interview she did with Rockwired, was the first song Curve ever wrote. And it starts with some cool samples and Tony's voice. And guess what? An awesome breakbeat, wah guitar, Dean's bass. Who would have thought? So yeah, Curve reminds me a lot of Italian cuisine. Because it's awesome, but it's all made from the same four ingredients and just endless variations. You have your meat, your bread, your tomatoes, your cheese. And I never expected to tie Curve's music in with my grandma's cooking, but here we are. And each of these tracks is delicious in their own way. So this tune, No Escape from Heaven, has some recurring riffs that make it more distinct to me, and it reminds me that I really have to get a Morley Crybaby pedal one of these days. And that moves us over to the Frozen EP, which starts with Coast is Clear, of course. Still my favorite song on here. It's a bit more sinister than the rest. It just goes down so easy. It's such an awesome, unique tune. I think it's maybe a bit more industrial while being supremely listenable and catchy. I love it. It's just a fantastic song. The Color Hurts is a slightly slower song, not a bad thing, because when you slow down a song that has beats, it just sounds groovier and funkier. And, they accentuate that here with some subtle tremolo guitar that might have been inspired by the Smiths' How Soon Is Now, or might not have, but, it's reminiscent of that. It sounds really cool. And more great vocals from Tony. The key to their success, I think, has always been her amazing vocals over this ridiculously energetic, noisy, but perfectly mixed soundscape where you can hear everything. That combination, it's like peanut butter and chocolate, or I don't know, like sweet and sour chicken or fish and chips. I don't know. Is it lunchtime yet? Anyway, you know what I'm saying. The sum is greater than the parts. And then we go on to the title track here, Frozen, another upbeat, up-tempo, major key song, D-sharp major to be precise. And, listening back to it, it occurred to me that there really is very little obvious keyboard or synth on any of these songs. The drums do sound programmed in that early 90s kind of way, but, who knows? Maybe they were all live and it just could have been Steve Osborne's production or Alan Moulder's mixing. But I think all the melodic sounds on this record are either voice or guitar. as far as I can tell. There isn't much like cheating with keyboards here. And I'm sure the stuff that sounds keyboard-ish, like the intro riff of this song, is just, affected out guitar, which is cool. And maybe explains why they were able to recreate all this live with, Tony, a drummer, a bassist, and 2 guitarists. But that rounds the EP out with one more song, which is Zoo. This is a slightly more down-tempo track. And, what can I say at this point, folks? It's more of the same. It's awesome, but it's following a formula, a winning formula. And that's the Frozen EP. And then we finally dive into the Cherry EP, which starts with Clipped, a song that would appear as a bonus track on the US version of Doppelganger. It starts with a spoken word sample before giving you, that familiar blast of Curve. And before you know it, you're neck deep in beats, bass, and guitar with Tony crooning over the top. Are these descriptions getting repetitive? Well, that's the album, I'm afraid. But trust me, it sounds amazing. Listening to this song, again, made me wonder who really did play all the guitar in these tracks, because if you listen closely, there's so many different things going on with the guitar. I wonder if Debbie and Alex were the ones that actually played it, because if so, they didn't get a writing credit. I don't know how that worked. Or maybe Dean just played it all, or Tony, I don't know. Only a few of these songs really have anything coming close to technical difficulty on a guitar. I think the genius of it is more just in the layering and the effects and in Alan Moulder's mixing. But anyway, Clipped is a very cool, if, characteristic tune. There's a lot going on there, of course. And you know what? So is Die Like a Dog, which might have Dean's funkiest bass line here because you can hear actual notes. And so is Galaxy. And by now you have to realize that Curve aren't going to deviate very far from their formula. Or are they? Because then we go into the final song in the EP, which is Cherry. It's the one tune here that's a little bit different. It's just Tony's breathy vocals over an ambient background, at least for the first minute and a half, after which a beat drops and we're right back in business. Or are we? Because it peters out again into beautiful ambience for about another couple minutes. And this is definitely the most varied tune on here. One that kind of makes me wish they would explore more in that vein. And then finally, to wind things up, we have the extended mix of Fait Accompli from the single. And it's, indeed a good 6.5 minutes of pure Curve goodness. Very dancey, very upbeat. Maybe Curve's poppiest song, which is why they selected it as a single to promote Doppelganger. Probably my second favorite song on here after Coast is Clear. And that's Pubic Fruit, the album. 3 EPs plus a bonus single. Just all amazing stuff. So what happened next? Well, Curve would go on for another 13 years or so. And I don't want to get too far into what happened then, because I might revisit some of their other albums later. But, it's safe to say they would inspire some similar sounding bands, like Garbage, for instance. So much was made back in the day in the music press as to whether Garbage were ripping off Curve at all. But you know what? These bands coexisted for a long time, and Garbage, of course, did have more market penetration, maybe because they had Butch Vig on board, who by then was very well known after producing Nirvana's Nevermind, a little album you might have heard of. So they were always going to have a leg up. And personally, I find Garbage's stuff to be more synthy and more poppy and less shoegaze and more commercial, if you will. Although, of course, there is some overlap there, and in a crude way, there's some similarity in their formulas. It's dance music fronted by a goth girl, because let's face it, Shirley Manson back in the day had a pretty similar look to Tony Halliday. So now let's fast forward 15 years or so. I'm down here in the bunker playing with my band, and afterward we're sitting around shooting the breeze as we do. And talk came around to our mutual love of Curve. And I pointed out that Dean did a one-off collaboration with KMFDM back in 2006, which they called KGC. And that was short for Konietzko Garcia Cifarelli, by the way. And they released one album called Dirty Bomb. And my bandmate laughed and said, yeah, that was right around the time I stopped working with Dean. And I was like, wait, what? Like, hold up. You worked with Dean Garcia? And I don't know how we had known each other for so many years, but I had never knew that. I never heard that story. But yeah, he had had some interaction with Curve back in the day when he was a full-time musician. He had done a remix of one of their tunes and had gotten their attention, and I think it even came out on a comp at one point. And anyway, Dean hit him up to do something together, and they did a collaboration. They made a few tracks, and he played them for me, and it was a mind blower because there was my bandmates sampling and arrangements and everything, but with Dean's signature bass in the background, I was just blown away. That was just super cool. And you can look this up for yourself if you don't believe me. The project was called Depth Charge. So yeah, check that out. Buy the tracks. I don't know if Dean is sharing income with my friend, but he should be. So yeah, that was really cool. And I even think there's more to that story. I might be getting some of it wrong. Like, I think my buddy covered that Curve song at a music festival, possibly in front of a big crowd, but I don't know all the details. Maybe he'll choose to comment, or maybe I could get him on here sometime to tell that story himself. Anyway, it was just very cool that he did a collaboration with Dean Garcia. So check out Depth Charge when you get a chance. Dean has at least one of these tracks on his Bandcamp, on his How Do You Feel compilation. So where are they now? Well, I'm sure you're dying to know that CD Now fell apart in 2000 in the wake of the dot-com bubble bursting, and in 2002 they were sold to Amazon. And ever since then, I could use the web to order any music I wanted, but without Telnet, it's just never been the same, frankly. But oh yeah, Curve. They disbanded in 2005, but both Tony and Dean continue to make music, just not together. They both have a long list of projects and collaborators, and maybe the most notable, is Dean's long-running project, Space-Eco, with his daughter, Rose Berlin, on vocals. And it's obvious on one listen that this project shares DNA with Curve. So if you like Curve, check it out. They release a lot of music. They release it pretty regularly. 17 albums and counting, plus what looks like a zillion EPs. Toni Halliday continues to make music under a variety of projects. To this day, I consider her one of the great frontwomen of alternative rock. So if you connected Susie Sue and Joan Jett over here and extrapolated that line to the right, Toni would be on it. What can you say? She's a badass. And I read a rumor that Curve considered reuniting in 2017, but Toni put the kibosh on it for now. But their legacy lives on. If imitation is the best form of flattery, Curve should feel flattered indeed, because they spawned a lot of bands that rode their coattails, yes, including Garbage. But I assure you, in 1992, Curve sounded like nothing else. In fact, they sounded like everything I wanted from a band. Power, beats, loud guitars, haunting vocals. Yes, it was a formula, but there's nothing wrong with a formula. Just ask the guy who invented Coca-Cola. I mean, how many billions of people enjoyed that formula? At least until 1985 with New Coke. You can't win them all. Anyway, despite all the comparisons to Garbage, I can still identify a Curve song within 5 seconds. And there's a lot to be said for laying claim to your own sound, for being that identifiable. Well, there you have it, folks. One of the truly original electronic rock bands of the 1990s, England's own Curve, and their compilation album, Pubic Fruit, that compiles their earliest recordings for the North American market. It's still a classic listen, definitely one to blast out the open car windows while barreling into the sunset on a late spring evening. And that's just a serving suggestion. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast. The show that is now complaining that it's too hot outside. It's too humid. There's too many bugs and there's too many little kids running around out there. So I'm just going to sit in the bunker here for 6 months and wait it all out. Yeah. As always, thanks for listening. And until next time, stay strong.